Hi, everyone. Really good to see you again. I'm Anne-Marie Green alongside Vladimir Duthier. Vlad, I wonder what's going on inside the White House right now. Is the president sort of scribbling down notes, erasing, starting again? Well, I guess you'd be doing it. You wouldn't do that, right? Because it's on probably on a computer. All right, deleting, starting again. He's sort of putting the final touches on his address before Congress, but also it's an address before the nation, basically telling us how well he thinks he's doing and what he hopes to accomplish in the future.
Yeah, well, somehow I don't think that the president is using his computer to make notes on his speech, given that I don't even use a computer to write my notes or anytime I have to deliver a speech because I'm a very bad typist. So we've all seen those images of former President Barack Obama sort of scribbling notes, on the speech by speechwriters and wording it in his own words. I'm guessing, speculating the president is probably doing the same. What's interesting about the remarks that he'll make tonight, Anne-Marie, is one of the things that's been noted by a lot of people is how President Biden seems to be able to connect with viewers and with voters in much smaller settings because he has a tendency to speak softly. He has a tendency to sort of look directly into the camera, and his words tend to carry a lot of emotion in them, if that makes sense. It's much different when you're speaking in a huge room like the chambers of Congress, where you've got to sort of speak for those in the back of the room, right? Even though we know it's not going to be a full crowd, it's a sort of a different setting. Former President Trump excelled at that, right? He excelled at the big crowds and the big rallies and getting people fired up. That's not really President Biden's sort of modus operandi. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays later this evening. But as you say, he's gearing up to deliver his first major address to Congress. That'll happen tonight. And this comes on the eve, of course, of his 100th full day in office. The president is expected to tout his administration's accomplishments while laying out his top legislative priorities moving forward, including his $1.8 trillion American Families Plan. Earlier on CBS This Morning, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki spoke about the education overhaul.
This is a really bold proposal, the American Families Plan. The American Families Plan is going to ensure that kids across the country, families across the country get 4 years of additional education, universal pre-K. That's not a partisan proposal. That's something people across the country really could benefit from. But the president believes we should propose a way to pay for it. So what you're talking about is raising the top rates, the top tax rates for 1% of Americans. 1%, the top rate, going back to what the rates were during former President George W. Bush's presidency to help pay for that.
Meanwhile, tonight's speech will be historic for many reasons. For the first time ever in American history, two women, Vice President Kamala Harris and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, will be seated behind the President of the United States as he addresses Congress. For more on this, let's bring in Weijia Jiang. She is following the very latest from the White House. Actually, Weijia, you caught up with Press Secretary Jen Psaki earlier. What did she tell you about tonight's speech and how things will play out?
Well, we knew already that President Biden is very involved in writing this speech with one of his main advisors, Mike Donilon, and his head speechwriter, Vinay Reddy. And he will continue to make tweaks, as he is known to do, until he delivers the address. She told us that it's about 5,000 words. That's as of last night. But of course, that is subject to change as those changes continue. And that this is the first time he is going to be front and center. She mentioned that he has, played a supporting role as the vice president. He's also attended several of these addresses to a joint session of Congress as a senator. And so he is very well versed in how they play out. Usually this is very different, of course, because we are in a pandemic. And to your point, Vad, it is in a much bigger room, but the crowd will be small, about 200 people compared to the usual 1,600. We do know that he's not practicing the speech today verbally because she said, he has to preserve his voice because it is expected to be a long one. But I think, that this is his moment. This is not a State of the Union per se. That's what his later addresses will be called. This one is just an address to a joint session, but it is an opportunity for him to tell the American people how he believes things are going and talk about his other priorities now that he has the first 100 days behind him.
So, Weijia, we know that the president is going to be talking about his administration's accomplishments and also kind of talking about future legislation that he hopes to pass, including the American Families Plan. But there have been other plans already that that America is familiar with, the infrastructure plan, the COVID plan. I presume that he'll be sort of talking about those plans as well, because he has to win over the American public and he has to win over Congress.
Right. So the plan that he's rolling out today is actually Infrastructure 2.0, if you will. It is the so-called human infrastructure plan that really gets into education, childcare, how things can be better for Americans. And that's already contentious because Republicans have claimed that this administration has redefined the word infrastructure and this should be completely separate. But you see here all of the things that he will talk about tonight. He will also begin to promote this tomorrow when he heads to Georgia for about a 10-day tour that will take top officials all over the country to about a dozen states to try to promote this bill. But to your point, Anne-Marie, yes, he still has to try to pass that initial phase of the infrastructure package. And he has a lot of other legislative priorities, too. And when you look at, how fractured this Congress is, he has a lot of challenges ahead of him to try to accomplish his agenda. But I think that's something we should expect him to address tonight, because he will mention what he has before, which is that the overwhelming number of Americans support his legislative plan, and therefore their elected officials should as well.
That's an excellent point, Weijia, which sort of leads to my question to you about Republicans slamming the president for failing to work with them. But as you point out, the polling that not only we have done but others have done suggests that the American people are generally behind the president when it comes to this. I looked at a Monmouth poll that came out last month in April, or this month actually. I'm already getting ahead of myself in May, but that showed that this $2 trillion plan has 68% support approval from the American public, 29% opposed. A majority of people, according to a CNN poll, approve of President Biden and the things that he's prioritizing. And also, I thought interesting, 59% of Americans who say President Biden is doing a good job keeping his promises, which outpaces the 100-day mark by either President Trump, which was 48%. So I think that that's sort of interesting, even though you've got Republicans that are sort of saying, well, he's not really working with us. And I know it's important to find ways to work with the other side, but when you've got the American people so broadly behind you, you've got the wind at your back. What are you hearing about how the White House feels about the Republicans' feelings?
Well, the White House has said they care more about Americans' feelings, and to what you just laid out, they have frequently cited different polls that show Republicans, in addition to Democrats, are supporting these measures. And so there's a big question about whether the president is redefining bipartisanship. And the press secretary has said bipartisanship to him does not mean what's happening in this zip code, does not mean what's happening in Washington, D.C., but whether he can unite the country outside of this town based on the things that he wants to do for everyday Americans, not just lawmakers. But, he does still, of course, want to, he says, find that bipartisanship and that support of GOP lawmakers, which we know that the White House is having private meetings with Republicans. They're trying to find some sort of compromise, but this is going to be a very long road ahead if every time the president wants to accomplish something, they have to rely on Democrats going at it alone. And so, it has only been 100 days. I think, people are just getting settled in and trying to understand better exactly how this administration will work. But I think we should expect to see more of officials pointing to these polls and pointing to what Republican Americans and not just lawmakers have to say about the agenda.
So, Weijia, South Carolina Senator Tim Scott will be delivering the Republican Party's national response to President Biden's speech. I've heard, a number of observers say that actually this was a pretty smart pick, particularly when we're talking about a Republican Party that, at times seems to be wrestling with its identity, seems to be dealing with issues related to unity within the party. Why was he chosen?
Well, I think we should expect a big part of President Biden's speech tonight to address police reform, and he will urge Congress to pass the George Floyd Policing Act, which would put a ban on chokeholds, make it easier to prosecute law enforcement, and get rid of immunity for police when it comes to these cases. On the other hand, Senator Tim Scott has his own policing bill that he wants to pass, and so perhaps that's one reason why he was chosen, because he is leading the GOP's effort to try to pass something. He's also the only black Republican senator in the Senate, and so that is very meaningful, I think, at a time when this country is quite divided on matters of race. And so I think we should expect him also to talk about ways forward, but to criticize the Democrats and the president's views when it comes to police reform in particular, in addition to all the other things that he will address, because this, again, is expected to be a very wide-ranging speech.
Yeah, Senator Tim Scott has been somebody who, as we know, has been trying to work with the Democrats to come up with a bipartisan solution for police reform. Weijia, before we let you go, I just, I mentioned it coming into your segment here, the historic nature. And it's interesting because I was thinking, do I ask Weijia about this because we're reporters and we're sort of supposed to sort of be objective about this, but just objectively speaking, since this has never happened in American history, it wouldn't bother me if it were two Republican women behind the President of the United States there, but just that imagery of having two women seated behind the President of the United States, one who is black and South Asian, and Nancy Pelosi, who's been in Washington, D.C. for a very, very long time. Just that imagery, I think, is going to just be very powerful as an American. Forget what I do for a living. I don't know if the White House has actually said anything about it. I know sometimes they like to sort of fly under the radar with this stuff, but it just will be a sort of historic tableau, one for the ages.
Well, Jen Psaki actually mentioned it this morning that, this is the first time we will see the President of the United States being flanked by two women, because typically it has been two men sitting behind the President during these joint addresses. Of course, as of recently, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has played that role. But this is a monumental occasion, and it has nothing to do with the pandemic, because we've been talking a lot about spacing and who can sit where, and the fact that there won't be, special guests in the First Lady's box, which really adds a lot to these speeches, because usually, those guests are chosen because they represent something that the president wants to do for that person, and people like that person when it comes to his agenda. But, this is because these two women have been elected, and because, we are closing the gap slowly but surely when it comes to traditional roles that we've seen men play in politics. And, they also share the fact that they are from the Bay Area in California, and they have spent many years together in Congress and with working with the president. And so I do think that it will not be lost on Americans, regardless of what political party they are, this very powerful image of two women for the first time supporting and sitting behind the President of the United States.
Indeed. Weijia, thank you so much.
Sure.